Jackson Thorne existed in a fortress of his own making, a cabin built of sturdy pine and silent grief, perched on the shoulder of a Colorado mountain. Each dawn, he rose with the discipline of a man whose life had once been measured in synchronized heartbeats and the cold calculus of mission success. At 42, the former Navy SEAL was a monument to order. His bed was made with punishing precision, the corners sharp enough to cut. His coffee maker was field stripped and cleaned daily. The wood for the stove was stacked in perfect interlocking cords, a bulwark against the encroaching wilderness and the chaos that lurked just beyond the tree line of his memory. This discipline was his armor, but it was also his cage. The cold that seeped through the floorboards was a familiar comrade, an external reflection of the permafrost that had settled over his heart 2 years prior. It was the winter Sarah had been taken from him, a senseless accident on an icy road that had dismantled his world with the brutal efficiency of a professionally laid charge. His grief was a silent, orderly thing, just like everything else in his life. It lived in the empty rocking chair by the fire, the one Sarah had loved, its runners still on the exact floorboards where she had last sat. It echoed in the hook by the door where the leash of Max, his military working dog, had once hung. Max had fallen in Kandahar, a hero's death shielding him from shrapnel, but his ghost patrolled the perimeter of Jax's solitude just as faithfully as he had in life. The loss of his wife and the loss of his partner had fused into a single massive wound, one he stanched, not with bandages but with routine, with silence, with the self-imposed isolation of a man who had decided he was done with attachments. He had commanded men in the most dangerous places on earth, but he could not command his own heart to feel anything but the dull, persistent ache of absence, so he chose to feel nothing at all. He was a soldier on his final posting guarding the tomb of his own past. The first flakes of the blizzard began as a whisper against the window panes, a gentle lie that spoke of peace and quiet. Jax watched them, his jaw tight. He knew the mountain's language. This was no gentle dusting. It was the opening salvo of a war. Within an hour, the whisper became a roar, the wind, a physical presence that slammed against the cabin walls. The world outside dissolved into a maelstrom of white, erasing the familiar shapes of pines and peaks, leaving only the howling chaos. It was the kind of storm that forced life to go to ground, to seek shelter, and wait for the onslaught to pass. Jack stoked the fire, the rhythmic scrape of the poker a small defiant sound against the storm's fury. He was content to be sealed in. The world outside held nothing for him anymore. It was a sound that broke through his defenses, a sound that should not have been there. Faint, desperate, it was a high-pitched cry, torn apart and scattered by the wind. He stilled, head cocked, every nerve ending, honed by years of listening for threats in the dark, suddenly alive. He told himself it was the wind, a branch scraping against the roof, an animal of the wild caught in the tempest. But he knew it was not. It was the sound of suffering, a frequency his soul, no matter how frozen, was still tuned to. He fought the impulse. His mission was to remain here, to guard this quiet place. To go out there was to engage, to risk, to feel. But the sound came again, sharper this time, a thin blade of sound that pierced the thick hide of his apathy. It was a plea. And Jackson Thorne, for all his brokenness, had never been a man who could ignore a plea for help. With a curse that was swallowed by the storm, he pulled on his insulated gear, the movements economical and swift. He was armoring himself again, but this time not against memory, but against the brutal, physical reality of the blizzard. He grabbed a high-powered flashlight, its beam a solid spear of light against the swirling vortex of snow. Stepping outside was like stepping into another dimension, a world of violent, roaring white. The cold was a physical blow, stealing his breath and stinging his exposed skin. He leaned into the wind, a ship cutting through a frozen sea, following the ghost of a sound, an instinct he thought he had buried long ago. He found her not 50 yards from his cabin, a dark shape huddled against the lee side of a massive granite boulder. She was a German shepherd, her noble head bowed against the wind, her coat matted with snow and ice. Her body was a thin, trembling rampart against the storm, and tucked beneath her, pressed into the small pocket of relative warmth she provided, were 3 tiny puppies, whimpering and blind. She lifted her head as he approached, not with a growl of aggression, but with a look of profound, exhausted dignity. Her amber eyes met his, and in their depths he saw not a feral animal, but a fellow soldier at the end of her strength. A mother holding the line against impossible odds. There was no fear in her gaze, only a deep, resonant understanding of sacrifice. It was a look he had seen before, in the eyes of men in their final moments, a look that said, "I have done all I can." In that instant, the ice around his heart did not melt, but it fractured, a deep seismic crack that let in a sliver of something he had not felt in years. A purpose. The mission parameters were clear, extraction immediate. There was no time for a detailed plan. Jax knelt, his movements slow and deliberate, broadcasting non-aggression. The mother dog watched him, a low rumble in her chest, not of threat, but of warning. "Be careful with my children." He reached out a gloved hand, letting her catch his scent. She sniffed it once, then gave a faint, almost imperceptible lick to the frozen leather. Permission granted. He unzipped his heavy-duty parka, creating a warm, dark cavern against his chest. One by one, he gently lifted the puppies. They were impossibly small, their bodies cold and trembling, their faint cries little more than squeaks of protest against the cold. He tucked them inside his jacket, their fragile warmth a strange and startling sensation against his own skin. The mother, now relieved of her charges, struggled to her feet, her legs shaking with cold and exhaustion. She was gaunt, her ribs visible even beneath her thick coat. She took one step, then faltered, her back leg buckling. Jax saw the dark stain of blood against the white snow, a deep gash on her hind leg that was already freezing over. She would not make it back to the cabin on her own. He looked at the shelter of his home, its warm lights a beacon in the blizzard, then back at the wounded animal. There was no choice. There never had been. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a soft woolen scarf. It was navy blue, Sarah's favorite. He had carried it with him for 2 years, a tangible piece of her warmth. Without a second thought, he wrapped the smallest, weakest puppy in its soft folds, securing it further within his jacket. Then, with a grunt of effort, he scooped the mother shepherd into his arms. The journey back was a battle. The dog was heavier than she looked, a dead weight of exhausted muscle and bone. The wind fought him for every inch, trying to rip her from his grasp, trying to push him off his feet. His old knee injury, a souvenir from a hard landing in the Hindu Kush, screamed in protest. Pain shot up his leg, hot and sharp. But he locked his jaw and pushed on, his focus narrowed to a single point, the warm glow of his cabin window. He was no longer just a man walking through a storm. He was a rescue vessel, his hull battered, but his purpose absolute. He was carrying life. He was carrying a mother and her children. He was carrying the ghost of his wife's kindness and the memory of his partner's loyalty. He stumbled through the door and collapsed to his knees on the hearth rug, the blizzard roaring behind him as the heavy door slammed shut. He gently lowered the mother dog to the floor, her body shivering violently. Then, carefully, he opened his jacket. The 3 puppies tumbled out, a small pile of bewildered, whimpering life, onto the warm wood. He unwrapped the smallest one from Sarah's scarf, its tiny body now stirring with more vigor. The mother immediately began to lick them, her rough tongue cleaning and stimulating them, her maternal instincts overriding her own pain and exhaustion. Jax sat back on his heels, his breath coming in ragged bursts, the sweat on his brow turning cold in the cabin's air. The sterile order of his fortress had been breached. Muddy, bloody paw prints now stained the immaculate floor. The scent of wet dog and birth mingled with the clean smell of pine and wood smoke, The profound silence he had cultivated for 2 years was shattered by the soft sounds of whimpering puppies and the gentle nuzzling of their mother. He looked at the scene before him, the sudden, messy, desperate explosion of life at the foot of his cold, empty hearth, and felt the foundations of his world shift. The enemy was inside the wire. And for the first time in a very long time, he did not feel the need to raise the alarm. He felt something else, something terrifying and unfamiliar. He felt the first fragile thaw. The hours that followed were a blur of clumsy, determined caregiving. Jax, a man trained to dismantle complex explosives and navigate by the stars, found himself utterly out of his depth. He warmed a can of chicken broth, testing the temperature on his wrist with an awkwardness that felt alien to his disciplined hands. He gently coaxed the mother dog, whom he had started thinking of as Sheba, to drink. She lapped at it weakly at first, then with more urgency, her eyes never leaving her pups. He cleaned the gush on her leg with antiseptic from his own first aid kit, his touch surprisingly gentle as he bandaged the wound. She endured it all with a stoic patience that reminded him so fiercely of Max. It was a physical ache in his chest. He created a makeshift whelping box out of a spare crate and lined it with old towels, moving the new family closer to the fire. The puppies, warmed and fed, settled into a twitching, sleeping pile, their tiny mouths suckling in their dreams. He watched them mesmerized. 2 were dark like their mother, but one was a lighter, sable, and seemed to possess an energy that defied his small size. Even in sleep, he kicked and squirmed, a tiny engine of boundless enthusiasm. The other dark one was preternaturally still, a quiet observer even with his eyes sealed shut. The chaos had a rhythm, he realized. It was the rhythm of life, something he had forgotten. His cabin, once a silent museum of loss, was now a nursery. By morning, the storm had broken, leaving behind a world transformed, buried under a thick blanket of pristine, silent snow. The quiet, however, was different. It was no longer the empty quiet of absence, but the peaceful quiet of sleeping creatures. The change was palpable. But with the clear skies came the practical realities. He was low on supplies, and the mother dog needed proper medical attention. His isolation, once a comfort, was now a liability. He was about to gear up to attempt the snow-covered road into town when he heard the rumble of an approaching engine. A battered but determined snowplow was making its way up his long private drive, and behind it was an old pickup truck that he recognized. Eleanor Vance was the town's unofficial matriarch, a woman in her 70s with eyes that had seen too much to be fooled by a man's silent exterior. She was a widow, having lost her husband years ago, and her only son, a Marine in Fallujah. An unspoken bond of shared, quiet grief existed between her and Jax. She appeared on his porch, holding a large thermal container. "Figured you might be running low after that blow," she said, her voice warm and practical. Then her eyes fell on the scene by the fire. She did not look surprised, only knowing. A slow, genuine smile spread across her face. "Well, look at that. Looks like you've got a new platoon, Jackson." Jax found himself at a loss for words. He simply nodded and stepped aside to let her in. Eleanor moved with a quiet efficiency, taking in the situation at a glance. She cooed at the puppies, her weathered hands gentle as she checked them over. She examined Sheba's leg with a practiced eye. "This needs a vet's touch, but you did a good job cleaning it up. You always were good at patching things up." She opened her container, revealing a rich, fragrant beef stew and a bag filled with old, clean blankets and a bottle of puppy milk replacer. "I had a feeling." "How?" Jax finally managed to ask, his voice rough from disuse. "A woman who's raised a boy in a litter of barn cats knows the sound of a man who suddenly found himself in charge of something helpless," she said, not looking at him. "It's a specific kind of quiet panic." She ladled stew into a bowl for him and another for Sheba. As they ate, a comfortable silence settled between them. It was Eleanor who broke it. My David, he brought home a stray once, scrawny thing, half-starved. He said every living creature deserves a fire to sleep by. She looked at Jax, her gaze direct and compassionate. He was right. It's not just for them, you know. The fire warms the keeper too. Over the next few days, a new routine established itself, one dictated not by military time, but by the needs of his new charges. The puppy's eyes opened, and their personalities began to bloom. The energetic sable one was a clumsy explorer, forever tumbling out of the box and attempting to scale the leg of a table before collapsing in a heap. Jax started calling him Buddy, for his relentless foolish bravery. The quiet, watchful one stayed close to his mother, his dark eyes following Jax's every move. He was cautious, hesitant, a small soul already weary of the world. Jax named him Shadow. He saw himself in the pup's reserve, in his silent observation. He found himself spending hours just watching them, the rigid armor of his grief softening with every clumsy puppy antic, with every trusting lick from Sheba. Buddy would launch himself at Jax's bootlaces, a tiny, ferocious warrior waging a losing battle against leather. One evening, after a particularly valiant assault, the puppy fell backwards, gave a dramatic yip, and then, as if nothing had happened, pounced on his own tail. A sound escaped Jax's lips, a short, sharp bark of sound he barely recognized. It was a laugh. The sound was so alien in the quiet cabin that Shadow startled, and Sheba lifted her head. Jax froze, feeling exposed, as if he had betrayed his own solemn vow of sorrow. But then he looked at the ridiculous, triumphant puppy, and the feeling that followed was not guilt, but a flicker of warmth, a lightness in his chest he had not felt since before the world had gone gray. Eleanor became a regular visitor, bringing supplies and wisdom. She never pried, but she listened. One afternoon, as they watched Sheba gently groom Shadow, Jax found himself speaking the words coming out haltingly, as if they were being excavated from a great depth. Max, my canine. He was a shepherd too, looked a lot like her, same eyes. He stopped, the lump in his throat too large to speak around. Eleanor simply placed a hand on his arm. They're good souls, she said softly. They know how to guard a man's heart. And sometimes they know how to mend it. It was the most he had spoken of his past in 2 years, and the confession, small as it was, felt like a pressure valve being released. The thaw was no longer a crack. It was a slow, steady melt. His fortress was becoming a home. The intrusion came on a bright, cold afternoon a week later. A white van with the county seal on its side crunched up his driveway. A man in a crisp uniform stepped out, his face set in an expression of professional neutrality. He introduced himself as Officer Miller from Animal Control. We had a report from a hiker about a stray German shepherd with pups in this area before the storm. Just following up to make sure everything's okay. Jax's entire posture shifted. He became what he had been before. A sentinel. He stood in the doorway, blocking the view into the cabin, his body a solid, unmoving barrier. Everything's fine, he said, his voice flat and cold, the clipped tone of a man giving a field report. Miller was unfazed. That's good to hear, but protocol requires I make an assessment. If they're strays, we need to take them to the shelter, check for microchips, and put them on a hold period before they can be adopted out. The words hit Jax like a physical blow. The shelter, separation, protocol. He thought of Shadow's fearful eyes, of Buddy's goofy trust, of Sheba's quiet dignity. He pictured them in a cold, concrete kennel, confused and alone. The idea was monstrous, an offense against the fragile peace he had just begun to build. No, he said, the word a piece of granite. Miller's expression tightened slightly. Sir, I understand you've helped them, and that's commendable. But the law is the law. They need to be processed. The mother and pups will have to be separated for evaluation. They're not strays, Jax heard himself say, the words a line drawn in the snow. They're mine. The officer raised an eyebrow. You just found them a week ago. You can't just claim them. There are procedures. They are a family, Jax interrupted, his voice low and dangerous, the ice returning. But this time, it was not the ice of grief, but of cold, hard fury. And they are staying here. Withney Miller sighed. A man caught between his rulebook and the unyielding force of a mountain. Look, I can give you some time, 72 hours. You get the mother licensed. Get the pups, a preliminary vet check. Show me you're taking official responsibility. If you do that, I might be able to file them as a direct owner. Surrender and adoption, and we can bypass the shelter hold. But if I come back in 3 days and nothing's been done, I have to take them. My hands are tied. He handed Jax a card for the county veterinarian, Dr. Anna Chen, before retreating to his van, leaving behind a ticking clock and the renewed threat of loss. Jax stood there long after the van was gone, the officer's words echoing in the sudden silence. The world he had tried so hard to keep at bay was now threatening to dismantle the one thing that had made him feel alive again. He was a soldier once more, and he had just been given his new mission: defend his family. The ultimatum from Officer Miller lit a fire under Jax. The quiet, introspective period of healing was over. It was time for action. He called the number on the card. Dr. Anna Chen's voice was calm and professional, but it held an undercurrent of warmth that immediately put him on edge. He was not used to warmth from strangers. He explained the situation in clipped, concise sentences, a field report stripped of all emotion. She listened patiently, then said, "Bring them in tomorrow morning." Then said, "We'll get it sorted." The next day, Jax loaded his new family into his truck with the logistical precision of a troop movement. Sheba, trusting him implicitly, hopped into the back. The puppies were secured in their crate, Buddy yipping with excitement at the new adventure, Shadow trembling in the corner, his dark eyes wide with apprehension. The drive into town was a strange ordeal. The familiar streets felt alien, the presence of other people, a low-grade irritant. He felt fiercely protective of the precious cargo in his truck, keenly aware of their vulnerability. Dr. Anna Chen was not what he expected. She was younger than he'd imagined, with kind, intelligent eyes and a gentle demeanor that seemed utterly unflappable. She handled the puppies with an expert touch, calming Shadow with a soft word and a gentle stroke. She examined Sheba's leg, praising Jax's handiwork. "You did a great job with this bandage," she said, looking up at him. "You have steady hands." As she worked, she talked, her voice a soothing murmur. She explained the shots the puppies needed, the food Sheba should be eating, the process for getting them registered. She treated him not as a gruff recluse, but as a concerned pet owner, and the simple act of her acceptance chipped away at another layer of his defenses. But as she scanned Sheba for a microchip, her brow furrowed. "That's odd," she murmured, running the scanner over the dog's neck again. "There's no chip, but feel this." She guided Jax's hand to Sheba's neck, hidden beneath the thick fur. He felt it, immediately a thin leather collar, worn and embedded deep into her coat, almost invisible. It was old, the leather cracked, and it must have been on her since she was much younger. Carefully, Anna worked it loose. It was a simple plain collar, but attached to it was a small, tarnished brass cylinder. Unscrewing it, she tipped out a tiny, tightly rolled piece of paper. It was yellowed with age and water damage. Anna carefully unrolled it. Inside, written in a faded, spidery hand, were a series of phone numbers and a short message. "If found, please call." "Her name is Hope." Jax's blood ran cold. Hope. Her name was Hope. All this time she had belonged to someone else. The family he had claimed as his own was not his to claim. A wave of something akin to panic washed over him. Officer Miller's rules were one thing. A prior owner was another entirely. This was a threat he could not fight with sheer force of will. Anna saw the look on his face. Jax, she said gently, this note could be years old. The numbers might not even be in service anymore, but we have to try. That afternoon, back at the cabin, Jack sat at his kitchen table, the tiny piece of paper laid out before him like an unexploded bomb. Hope he could not bring himself to call her that. She was Sheba to him, lay at his feet, her head on her paws, watching him. Buddy and Shadow were wrestling on the rug, oblivious. Well, he picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over the first number. Every instinct screamed at him not to make the call, to tear up the paper and pretend it never existed. But his ingrained sense of duty, the very discipline that had defined his life, would not allow it. He had to know. He called every number that day. The first two were disconnected. The third was answered by a confused young man who had only had the number for 6 months. The fourth went to a voicemail for a business that had closed down years ago. With each failed call, a small, treacherous seed of relief took root in his heart. Maybe it was a dead end. Maybe they were his, after all. He dialed the last number, his heart pounding a heavy, nervous rhythm against his ribs. It rang once, twice, 3 times. He was about to hang up when a voice answered, thin and reedy with age. Hello? Hello, Jax, said his own voice tight. I'm calling about a dog. A German Shepherd. I found a collar with this number. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Hope, you found my Hope? The voice cracked with emotion. Oh, thank God, I thought she was gone forever. The story spilled out, a torrent of grief and relief from an old man named George. Hope had been his wife's dog. After his wife passed away, Hope had been his only companion. 2 years ago, during a summer thunderstorm, a falling tree had broken part of his fence, and a terrified Hope had bolted. He had searched for months, put up flyers, called every shelter, but she was gone. He had eventually given up, assuming the worst. He lived 2 counties over, a long way for a dog to travel. Jax's world tilted on its axis. 2 years, the same amount of time he had been grieving Sarah. Sheba had been lost and alone in the wilderness for 2 years, surviving on her own, and had given birth in the middle of a blizzard. His admiration for her deepened into profound respect, but the reality was crushing. She had a home. She had a person. He made arrangements for George to come the next day. After he hung up, he sat in the deepening twilight, the silence of the cabin once again feeling heavy and oppressive. He had found them, rescued them, and pieced together a fragile, new life from the wreckage of his old one. And now he was going to lose them. The mission had changed again. Now it was to surrender. The next morning was funereal. Jax moved with a heavy, deliberate slowness, the weight of the impending separation pressing down on him. He fed Sheba and the puppies, his hands lingering as he stroked their soft fur. Buddy, ever the optimist, tumbled around his feet, but Jax could not bring himself to smile. Shadow seemed to sense the change in atmosphere. He huddled close to his mother, his watchful eyes fixed on Jax, a silent question in his gaze. Jax looked around the cabin at the chew marks on the leg of the table, the scuffed patch on the floor where the puppies loved to play, the warm indentation on the rug by the fire. His fortress had been transformed into a home, and now its heart was about to be ripped out. An old, well-kept sedan pulled into the driveway, precisely at the agreed-upon time. An elderly man, leaning heavily on a cane, slowly made his way to the door. He had kind, watery blue eyes filled with a nervous hope. When Jax opened the door, Sheba, who had been dozing, shot to her feet, her ears perked. She let out a soft whine. Hope, George whispered, his voice trembling. The dog's tail gave a tentative wag. She took a hesitant step forward, then another, sniffing the air. A flicker of recognition sparked in her eyes. She whined again, a sound of deep, buried memory, and trotted forward, nudging her head into the old man's outstretched hand. George burst into tears, his hands burying themselves in her thick fur. Oh, Hope. I never thought I'd see you again. Jax watched the reunion from the doorway, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. This was the right thing to do. It was his duty. But it felt like a betrayal. George looked up, his face streaked with tears of joy. Thank you, he said to Jax. Thank you for saving my girl. Then he saw the puppies, who had cautiously emerged from behind the couch to see what the commotion was. His eyes widened in astonishment. Good heavens, she had pups. For the next hour, George sat by the fire, Sheba Hope pressed against his legs, as if afraid he would disappear again. He was captivated by the puppies. He listened intently as Jax told him the story of their rescue from the blizzard. As he spoke, Jax found himself describing their personalities, Buddy's foolish courage, Shadow's quiet soulfulness. George nodded, a sad smile on his face. My Mary, my wife, she would have loved this. She always said this house was too quiet after the kids left. He looked around Jax's cabin. This is a good place. A strong place. You've given her a good home here. Then came the moment Jax had been dreading. George looked at Hope, then at the puppies, then at Jax. His shoulders slumped. I don't know what to do, he confessed, his voice frail. I'm 84 years old. I can barely manage myself and one old dog. There's no way I can handle 2 puppies. They need a yard to run in, a young man to throw a ball for them. They need you. Jax stared at him, not daring to believe what he was hearing. I can't separate them from their mother, George continued, his voice thick with emotion. And I can't take her from them. Not now. But I can't give them the life they deserve. He looked at Jax, his old wise eyes, seeing straight through the layers of armor to the man beneath. But you can. I see the way you look at them, and the way that little quiet one looks at you. He's chosen you. He took a deep, shaky breath, a man making a great sacrifice. They belong here, with you, all of them. As long as you'd let an old man come visit his girl from time to time. Relief washed over Jax with the force of a tidal wave, so potent it almost brought him to his knees. He could only nod, his throat too tight for words. He was not losing his family, he was gaining one more member. George stayed for the rest of the afternoon, sharing stories of his wife and Hope's puppyhood. When he finally left, promising to return in a week, Jax walked him to his car. The old man paused and put a hand on Jax's arm. You know, he said softly, sometimes we think we're the ones doing the rescuing, but most of the time, we're the ones who are being rescued. As the sedan pulled away, Jax stood on the porch, the cold mountain air sharp in his lungs. Sheba came and sat beside him, leaning her weight against his leg. Buddy tumbled out the door and immediately tried to chase a falling leaf, tripping over his own paws. Shadow emerged more slowly, coming to sit on Jax's other side, his small body a warm, solid presence. Jax looked out at the mountains, their snow-covered peaks glowing in the late afternoon sun. The world was no longer gray. It was vibrant, alive, and filled with a quiet, profound sense of peace. He had faced down storms both outside and within. He had confronted the ghosts of his past and the bureaucracy of the present. He had been prepared to surrender, to sacrifice his newfound happiness for the sake of duty. And in the end, he had been given a gift beyond measure. His fortress had become a sanctuary. His self-imposed prison had become a home. He had a new platoon, a new mission. And for the first time in 2 long years, Jackson Thorne felt the unmistakable, undeniable warmth of hope. He was the rescuer who had been rescued,